is Charles Brookover, and I'm sitting here at the Holiday Inn Express in Circleville, Ohio. The date is July 1st, 2011, and I'm sitting here with Jim Cook, who was former, how shall we say, farm manager? No.
My father was at one time.
Okay. But lived and worked at Malabar Farm for a few years during the time period of Louis Bromfield. We'd like to have some questions here to ask Mr. Cook, and anything he'd like to add to our conversation today. And you were saying, Jim, you want to say a little bit about Louis to begin with?
Yeah, came back to Ohio. Originally they went to, he was a reporter in New York, and they went to France. He drove an ambulance in the First World War, and he liked France, and so when he came back, he met Mary Bromfield, who lived in New York. She was of some wealth, and so they were subsequently married. They moved to France. They had a villa there, and they were there until 1939, when Hitler started to rattle his saber about invading France, and they fled, literally leaving everything, when he started his invasion. And they came back to this country and came back to Ohio. His parents' farm was north of Mansfield, and he was hoping to repurchase that and start his dream farm. What he found out was that it was now a subdivision in Mansfield, no longer viable. So they started cruising around the environs, and they drove into Pleasant Valley, and you approach down the valley on the Valley Road, and they decided this was it. So they bought the Anson farm.
What was the name?
Anson, A-N-S-O-N, and that became the nucleus, and they built the big house. We always called it. It was their chateau here, and it was using the Anson house as the entrance hallway and the stairwell. It became the center, in effect, of the mansion, and they built out from both sides of it. I made contact with the architect in Mansfield who had designed it at that time or later, and he gave me a plan of the place, and I actually made a report in my architectural schooling at Ohio State. So I was familiar with the building in more ways than one. Anyhow, they added 5 more farms that surrounded it, and eventually ended up with just short of 1,000 acres. Part of it, if you know Pleasant Valley, it's hilly, so part of it was woods, a substantial portion of it. I suppose there were 455 acres that were arable, and the rest of it was forest or pasture. We went there in 1941, so he built in 39, and we went in 1941. His first manager had left to go to another job, gave speeches all over the area. And he was quite a, well, you know about him that he was quite a how should I say, he believed in certain practices of farming which were conservative, but also far advanced that most farmers wouldn't have attempted. And so he'd been preaching this about the county, and Dad had gone to several of these meetings where it took us along. We'd heard the talks. So Dad was interested, and so he decided to go. We were farming a farm about 6 miles from Malabar at the time. And we sold out our equipment and moved there. And we moved in, it was 1941, I believe it was. First house we lived in is the one that is now the inn. At that time, it had no interior bathrooms, no, the fireplaces in every room had been oiled up and coal stoves installed. So we had an outhouse, and we lived in it the first year that way. As we began to make the remodeling motions, that first year was a bear.
How old were you at that time?
I was high school age. I was, let's see, 41. I graduated in 43, so it gives you an idea. I was apparently a sophomore. And we had just moved to the Valiant place about the year before, so we hadn't been there long. Our total residency there was 2 years, so we left pretty early.
Could I stop you there, Jim?
Yeah.
You're just about the place where I think it'd be interesting to pick up. I want to know a little bit about yourself, some of your background there. What date were you born? What was your birthday?
November 15th, 1925.
And where were you born at?
I was born in Columbus.
In Columbus. Okay. And your father's name was?
Kenneth Cook.
Kenneth Cook. And your mother's name?
Martha.
Okay. And where do you currently reside now? Not in Ohio, I take it.
No, we live in Bellingham, Washington.
Okay. Now, what was your father's background? You mentioned he was a mechanic and a farmer. What sort of education did he have growing up?
He had a high school education, plus he had some night school in mechanics, engine, automobile mechanics. Automobiles were just coming in at that time. He graduated from high school, and he and my mother ran away their senior year. They got married.
Was he born in Ohio?
Yes. His father was 29 when he died. Consumption was usually and then, so Dad was, through most of his lifetime, he was actually taken care of by grandparents who had a farm. So he had a farm background to the extent that he lived on a farm when he was growing up, but he didn't know a heck of a lot about farming yet. And so when after he and Mom got married, he went to night school and studied batteries, and he opened a battery shop. And at that time, we rebuilt batteries, automobile batteries. And so he had a going business, and he also was going to night school to study auto mechanics. And,
where was he going to school at?
Columbus.
And he was living in Columbus at the
They were living in Columbus at that time, yes. And
then he moved to near Mansfield there?
He moved to Mansfield in 1930. Must have been about 1939. cut meat, and he got a job at on Saturdays, weekends, cutting meat at Basie's Meat Market. And I remember Mom and us kids would walk down and meet him on Saturday night when he came home and help him carry the groceries home. He got paid in groceries. That's how we ate. And we struggled along until about 1936 or 7, maybe 36. We moved to a small acreage behind the cemetery in Mansfield. It was 25 acres with a brick Victorian house, big old monster that looked like a ghost, haunted house. There was a barn and chicken house and so forth. And so this is where we learned the hard way how to farm. We started a truck garden, a vegetable garden, if you will, a 5-acre one. And to this day, I can't welcome weeding in gardens.
Was he farming with horses there at his place?
Yes, at first we had a single white horse. She was blind. Her name was Florida. And when she'd go in and out of the barn, her head had to be ducked to go through the door. And he'd take her, lead her, and he'd say, "Duck, Flora," and she'd duck and go through the door.
So you folks stayed at that house until
We were there for 3 years, I think. And then we started moving about. We went to a real farm in 1937. He bought a farm with 50 cents in his pocket, believe it or not. And that was down near Lucas, Ohio. In fact, it was right on the edge of town. It was just under 100 acres. And now here he had to do real farming. We had a team of horses. And eventually we had 2 teams, and I learned to use a team of horses during that time. And so we began to get bigger acreage into corn and wheat and so forth and become a real farm operation, but we still couldn't really make ends meet. It was too small a farm really to be viable. And so he lost it. We just couldn't make the payments. And we started, the Virginia Joint Stock Land Bank had bought up foreclosed farms all over Ohio. And they would have a couple that would go around and they would move onto one of these empty farms and fix up the house and the barn and start to clear the fields again and get them into cultivation. That's what we did. And we would burn off the fields to get them down to where we could plow them. And as soon as we got to the place going, they would put it up for sale. And then we'd move on to the next one. So we moved every year for about 3 or 4 years then. And
mainly in the Mansfield area?
Yeah. Well, it was actually south of Mansfield, Belleville, if you're familiar with that area. And so that finally that ended. And our next gig was to a real farm that we rented or leased from Ballius, who were a retired farm couple. And they had moved to town, and we rented their place and operated it, and that's where Louis came to get him.
Okay. Now, just a little bit about your mother. What was her background? Was she born in Ohio as well?
Yes. She was born in Athens.
Okay.
And the dad was born in Logan. So this actually, I've been back into this area many, many times. moved to Logan. I haven't researched their background that far back to know when that was, but they lived there during that time, at least that she was in high school.
Is that where she met your father?
Yeah.
You mentioned briefly, so your family was renting this farm. Did the land join up to what will later become Malabar Farm, or how did your father meet Louis Bromfield?
Actually, we met him at one of his talks, which would be at a farm somewhere around Mansfield, and then he.
Did your father recall the first time they actually spoke together?
No. When Louis approached him, he had reports from someone else that Dad was a farm mechanic as well as a farmer, and that they knew he was looking for that sort of a person, and they suggested they contact Dad. So that's how that happened, I believe.
So you said the family basically sold off what they had, and he provided the place there, which would later become the inn for you folks to move into. And
we started to rejuvenate the fields around that place. And
so he had, this was something that he had been doing already since you said 1939.
I think this was the last place this particular, where the inn is, that farm was the last one he purchased. And it was some time after he purchased the others. So we moved in when he first took possession. And our first time in the fields there, we had planted oats. And I remember taking the combine out to reap the field when it got right. We got out there in the field and looked at it, and it was no higher than that. It was right, but it was no higher than that. So we turned around and went back to the barn.
About the size of a playing card.
And so we plowed that down, which was his way of doing things. And so we planted ladino clover, which was his favorite, in these fields. And we started plowing that down. We'd plant it, let it grow, get about that high, and we'd plow it down. And gradually build up humus in the soil.
Hardboard plow. Do you remember the first time that you met Mr. Bromfield?
It was, the first time I met him was actually after we had moved onto the farm.
Okay. Any first impressions there? Do you remember? How old were you?
Well, I was in high school, so I was about, I must have been about 16 or 17. And I was able to operate heavy farm equipment. I'd been doing it for some time. And so he got a bonus because I could operate his combine and various other things. And I also had been trained by my father to be a mechanic. So he got two mechanics instead of one.
And in all total, you say you moved there in 1941?
Yes.
Correct. How long did you stay there? What was, at what point did you leave? What year?
It would have been 1952. I left to go back to architectural school.
Okay. And did your family stay on there?
Yeah, they did. And they didn't leave Malabar until, 3 or 4 years before he died.
Have you read Bromfield's books on Malabar?
I read all the Malabar books, yes.
Okay.
But
if so, would you consider much of what he says in his books his interpretation of the development of the farm, the sort of lifestyle you live there, the workings, and, shall we say, the achievements of the farm in restoring the soil? Do you consider those to be fairly accurate?
I would, yes.
And realistic?
I know a lot of our compatriots didn't believe that, but we knew it to be true.
Yeah, you would say it's fairly accurate. Okay.
Is that Malabar Farm there?
Yeah, we brought along a copy of Malabar Farm.
Oh, this is kind of sketches. Does the other one have photos in it?
Yeah, it's, I brought along Out of the Earth, and I figured some photographs of you in here.
Yeah.
Right here.
That's my dad. That's Louis. That's one of the French boys that we had. Ladino Clover. That's my dad. That's me.
About how old would you have been in those photographs?
Oh, see, when we took up the Grand Plow, I was working full-time on the farm, so I had graduated. This would have been 1943 or so, probably. The Ferguson tiller was the preliminary of the Bramhall tiller.
That was the first implement.
First one. This was made in England, and we imported them. Well, the tractor was made in England too. Once we had
Ferguson.
We had 4 Ferguson tractors that they sent us to try them on the farm, try to introduce them. People didn't know anything about them. So we actually considered taking on the agency. That's me.
What did your father think of Bromfield?
He sort of, I idolized him in a way, you know. They got along very well. You have to understand that community, there were 5 families basically on the farm. And we operated as a community separate from the neighborhood. Largely because we were different, we were doing things different, we were watched. And something like this turned heads. And I can recall during this time, we had at least 500 acres down at the Conservancy. It was all flat land along there by Pleasant Valley, by the lake. And it was flood land that would be flooded under some circumstances, but we operated as long as it was dry. And I had, we had a field of hay. We had cut it, and it rained, and finally the hay molded